The guest arrived in early spring, when the palace walls were still damp from winter rains, and the plum trees in the southern courtyard had just begun to bloom.
Hi, please click on the subscribe button and maybe leave a comment. Thanks.
He came aboard a royal ship, escorted by Ming sailors and diplomats, his presence announced with quiet importance. His name was Zuberi, and he was from the far western coast of the world, beyond Arabia, beyond India, from a place few had seen but many speculated about. They called it the land of Kunlun. Zuberi was tall, at least a head taller than any man in the palace. His skin was the color of dark wood, smooth and unscarred. His shoulders were broad and his arms long and muscular. His black hair was tightly coiled and held by long plaits that fell down to his shoulders and held away from his face by a strip of leather. He wore an intricately patterned wrapper around his waist that fell to just above his knees, exposing lean, strong legs and the hint of muscular thighs, and around his shoulders was a large, matching brocade wrap with silver and gold threads that glinted in the sun. He wore no adornment except for a single bone pendant carved into the shape of a horned beast hanging from a string around his neck, and multiple strings of cowries around one wrist. He entered the hall of foreign guests, walking behind Emperor Zheng He, and exuding such grace in his stride that eyes focused on him. He was utterly unlike anything they had seen. Zuberi did not speak Chinese. His voice was deep and calm, and he spoke through a Malay merchant who had traveled with Zheng He's ships before and spoke enough of both their languages to serve as an interpreter. But even without words, Zuberi's eyes held meaning. They were sharp and observant, yet patient and amused, happy to answer questions about himself, his land and people, and enjoying the parley of wits in which he engaged with his questioners. The court treated him with formal honor, bowed heads, ceremonial meals, and carefully worded questions. But under the surface, there was tension. He was not given a voice in meetings. He was not offered gifts meant for equals. Instead, he was seated on a raised platform like a rare curiosity, while ministers and scholars discussed him in low voices. Some came to study him up close, his teeth, his skin, the patterns on his clothes. They asked about his gods, his rulers, whether his people were civilized. Zuberi answered politely through the interpreter, never raising his voice, never revealing frustration. But behind curtains and paper walls, eunuchs and officials spoke of him like he was a caged animal. Most insulting of all, he was forbidden to see the women of the court. The emperor had declared that no unmarried lady or concubine was to be near the foreign guest. The excuse was decorum. The truth was fear. Fear that the mere presence of such a man could disturb morals of the palace. Far across the palace grounds, tucked behind a set of high stone walls and quiet paths, lived Lady Anne and her daughter, Yue Bai. Once, Lady Anne had been a favored concubine of the emperor. But time, politics, and a perceived slight of the emperor had seen her banished to the cold palace, a lonely set of quarters where fallen women waited out the rest of their days. Yue Bai had grown up there, surrounded by silence, shadows, and the scent of dried herbs her mother used to keep her hands busy. Now 19, Yue Bai was clever, gentle, and too quiet for her age. She had never been to court banquets, never danced in the spring festivals. Though of noble blood, she had no suitors. Her mother's disgrace followed her like smoke. Yue Bai read scrolls by lamplight. She copied poems and mixed ointments. Sometimes she spoke with the older servants about the world beyond the cold palace. One afternoon, as she prepared a salve for a swollen ankle, she heard something new. "They say he's dark as the night sky," maids were whispering just outside the gate, wide-eyed, "and tall, taller than the palace guards." "Who?" Yue Bai asked, stepping outside her quarters to hear more. She received no proper greeting, as should have been her right by rank, but rather an annoyed curtsy and rolled eyes, but they answered her. "The guest, from the Kunlun. He walks like a king, even though they treat him like a beast." One of the younger eunuchs snuck a look at him, said his arms are thicker than a bamboo stalk. Yue Bai's hands stopped moving. "They keep him inside the southern courtyard?" "Yes, and no women are allowed near. Orders from the emperor." That night, Yue Bai sat awake for a long time. She had read about men from distant lands, with skins like obsidian and voices like thunder. Her old tutor once told her that when Zheng He sailed west, he brought back lions and giraffes, even pearls the size of plums. But she had never seen such wonders. Her world was only stone walls, the scent of jasmine, and the occasional distant echo of court music. She knew she should not care. But the idea of this man, the man who was tall, dark, foreign, and alone, tugged at her. The next morning, she rose early and made her way to the southern courtyard via a roundabout way, sneaking behind trees and decorative rocks, unseen by the guards, until she stood at a part of the fence that surrounded the courtyard. She brought a basket of dried plum blossoms and pretended to be gathering them for her mother's bath. There she removed a brick, revealing a hole she herself had made as a child, and she saw him. Zuberi stood in the center of the courtyard, bare from the waist up, moving slowly through a series of practiced motions. He stepped, turned, bent, and rose, each movement controlled and balanced. The muscles of his back and arms flexed with purpose. He did not look around. He did not speak. He was simply present, like a tree that had always stood where it did. Yue Bai watched, half her face hidden behind her veil. And then, suddenly, he stopped. He turned slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. She froze. But instead of turning away, Zuberi bowed his head slightly, a soft gesture that held neither shame nor arrogance. Then he turned back to his movements, as if he had seen nothing out of place. Yue Bai left quickly, heart pounding, but she would come again. And so, the first thread of a forbidden story was tied, between a girl raised in silence and a man who had crossed oceans, both prisoners of a world that had no place for their kind of freedom. Zuberi had grown tired of the staring. Since the moment he arrived at the palace, he had been studied, measured, examined, and discussed, never truly spoken to. Every day, men in long robes came to ask questions they hardly waited to hear answered. They debated his height, his strength, his language. They brought out scrolls and compared him to ancient beasts or bronze statues. No one asked what he liked to eat or if he missed home. They asked if his people believed in spirits. They asked if his women wore clothes. They asked if he could read. Sometimes they pointed at his pendant, asking if it was magic. He began to rise before dawn, before the curious had time to assemble. In the silence of the courtyard, Zuberi exercised. He moved through the forms he had learned from the hunters of his youth: balance, breath, control. Each step, each stretch, calmed the noise in his mind. The courtyard stones were cold, but the sky above was open, and here he could pretend, for a while, that he was just a man in his own land. It was during one of those early mornings that he noticed the girl. He could see her face clearly, though much of it was hidden behind a silk veil, just where the shadows fell from the curved palace roof. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but when he turned again, he saw the glint of eyes, watching, not studying. He didn't look away. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, a quiet greeting. She didn't flee. She stayed still, barely visible, but no longer pretending to be invisible. The next morning, he saw her again, and the one after that. There was something different about the way she looked at him. It wasn't the cold curiosity of the court scholars, nor the fearful glances of the servants. She didn't look at him like he was strange. She looked at him like he was real. Days passed, and small things began to appear on the low stone bench near the courtyard tree. A wrapped piece of dried fruit, a scroll with a short poem, simple characters written in a soft, flowing hand. A cup of herbal tea, warm, its scent sweet and calming. Zuberi didn't know where the gifts came from, but he suspected. He left a gift in return, a small carved animal figurine, shaped from soft wood he had whittled with a piece of sharpened shell. He placed it on the same bench. The next day, it was gone. The exchange became a ritual. She left plum blossoms. He left shell beads from his pouch. She left a folded silk ribbon. He tied it into a knot and placed it in the hole where she sat. Their hands never touched, but something deeper was growing between them: recognition. A few days later, he found a note tucked beneath the teacup. The characters were neat and carefully chosen. "I see you. Not what they say you are. You are a man. Do you miss home?" He sat with the note for a long time. That night, under a waning moon, the soft scuff of footsteps reached him in the courtyard. It was the young eunuch, one of the quieter ones who often brought his meals. The boy stood nervously, then held out a silver hairpin. "She wants to meet," he whispered. Zuberi nodded. That was the beginning. Each night, when the corridors were empty and the guards napped against the stone, Zuberi and Yue Bai met in the shadowed corners of the courtyard garden. She wore a pale robe, her long black hair tied simply, her eyes always watchful. She brought him sweets wrapped in lotus leaves, and he taught her words in his tongue. Friend, moon, home. They laughed over mispronounced syllables, shared fruit from the garden trees, and sat side by side while she read from old scrolls. He couldn't understand the words, but her voice was soft and full of color. In return, he sang to her in a low hum, ancient songs from the coast of his homeland, where sea met sand and the wind was never still. He told her of the tall grasses of his village, of the women who painted their arms in red clay, and the hunters who danced before storms. She told him of palace walls, of being forgotten, of watching the world pass her by. They touched only briefly, fingers brushing when passing a cup or shoulders resting close, but each touch spoke louder than words. For the first time since arriving, Zuberi felt seen, not as a specimen or a story, but as a man with dreams, thoughts, and sorrow. And for the first time in her life, Yue Bai felt free, not as a daughter of shame or a girl in hiding, but as someone who mattered. In their stolen nights, in whispered laughter and small gifts, a quiet, fragile love bloomed. But it was not very long before whispers wafted through the palace like smoke under doors, first among the eunuchs, then to the older servants. A young court girl had seen a figure near the foreign guests' quarters, a teacup out of place, a fruit bowl left at night. Too many small things, just enough to raise quiet eyebrows. The eunuch who had aided Yue Bai began to grow anxious. He had taken her silver eagerly at first, thinking her curiosities were harmless. But now, his eyes twitched at every passing footstep, and he warned her in hushed tones one evening. "People are watching. I cannot help you much longer." Yue Bai's mother, Lady An, noticed the change in her daughter's demeanor, how she sat by the window longer than usual, how she touched her hair absent-mindedly and smiled at no one. Lady Anne had long been resigned to her place in the cold palace, discarded but not forgotten. But her daughter's future still flickered like a stubborn flame. "What are you doing, child?" she asked one evening. "This is not a world where love saves you." Yue Bai turned her face away, neither denying nor confirming. Her silence was enough. Meanwhile, Zuberi was working in his chambers. Using a small knife and hours of patient effort, he carved a thin band from ivory, polishing it until it gleamed like moonlight. Into it, he set a tiny disc of green jade. "This," he told Yue Bai during one of their late-night meetings, "is from my homeland. We give this to a woman who walks through fire and does not burn. A woman with courage." Yue Bai held it close to her chest. "Then I'll wear it," she whispered. Days passed, their meetings growing briefer, their words more urgent. Fear crept in, but so did resolve. In one quiet moment beneath a flowering pear tree in the outer courtyard, Zuberi brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You lie in my eyes," he said, "and you lie in mine," she answered. Their lips met softly, then surely. For a moment, time held its breath, but just beyond the trees, someone did not. A figure in the shadows turned and slipped away into the dark. That night, Zuberi was awakened by boots on stone and the crash of his chamber doors. He stood, but before he could speak, rough hands bound his arms. He did not resist. Yue Bai, roused from sleep, was dragged by her wrists to the Department of Corrections. Her bracelet fell from her sleeve, bouncing once on the cold tile floor before being crushed under a soldier's boot. Lady Anne was summoned to the Emperor's hall. As she stood before the golden throne, her breath shallow and eyes steady, she understood that her daughter's life now rested on her own forgotten voice. And for the first time in many years, she stepped forward with purpose. The Dragon Hall was colder than usual. Its wide marble floor gleamed beneath the lantern light, and every sound echoed: footsteps, whispers, breaths held too long. Guards stood like statues, their eyes blank. Ministers lined the sides, their silken robes rustling like dry leaves. The weight of centuries bore down on every carved beam. At the end of the hall, beneath a golden dragon coiled across the ceiling, sat the Son of Heaven himself, Emperor Zheng He, his face hard as jade. Zuberi was brought in first, his wrists bound in silk cord. Though treated with some dignity, he had been watched like a dangerous animal since his arrest. His skin, darker than any who stood in the hall, shone under the firelight. His back was straight, his jaw firm. He did not look down. "Do you know why you are here?" the emperor asked, voice like thunder wrapped in velvet. Zuberi nodded. "Because I loved her." Gasps filled the room. The translator hesitated, his hands shaking, but repeated the words faithfully. "She is of noble blood," one minister hissed. "She is not married," said another, "and he is a guest beneath her." "Did you seduce her?" the emperor asked, eyes narrowed. Zuberi met his gaze. "No, she chose me, and I chose her. There was nothing shameful in it." The ministers muttered again, some in disgust, others in fear of the emperor's rising fury. Emperor Zheng. His hands tightened on the carved armrests of his throne. Then Yue Bai was brought in. Her hair loosed from its neat bun, her silk robe wrinkled, her eyes red from crying, and she cowered before her father. One of the advisors stepped forward to condemn her as reckless, disobedient, and dishonorable. "Enough," the emperor barked. He was frustrated, caught between duty and desire, because although he had a duty to make an example of the two culprits before him, he had no desire to harm either his daughter nor his guest. "Take her back to the Department of Corrections and seclude him in his quarters. I will give my decision on a later day." Lady Anne, kneeling outside, had heard the news from servants and was glad for a few days of reprieve to think of a way to save her only child. She sent a message to Minister Qian, where fate finally gave her a card to play. He received it with disdain, but then, after thinking about it again, he decided to make her a pawn in his game. Minister Qian was a long-standing rival of the emperor's favored concubine and was determined to replace her son's position as the emperor's favorite with the son of his cousin, who was also one of the emperor's women. His plan was to poison him slowly, making him sickly and unable to accompany the emperor any longer. However, he needed someone to give the poison to him. Lady Anne could use the excuse of being out of favor to pretend to curry favor from him for her daughter by sending him gifts, including the tea. So he visited Lady Anne with the proposal, and in return he would be a strong voice to convince the emperor to have mercy on Yue Bai. Lady Anne was quick-witted and sent a portion of the tea along with a message for the emperor. "From the soil of his homeland, your minister sends this leaf, sweet on the tongue but bitter to blood. He bids me serve it to your son, saying nothing blooms without a buried root." Within 2 days, she was summoned before the emperor. His eyes softened when he saw his former favorite, her beauty now marred by years of deprivation and neglect. Lady Anne revealed what she had heard, naming the minister and the intended victim. He signaled a guard, who left swiftly to confirm the story. Within an hour, the truth was clear. The plot was real. The minister had already arranged the poison. Lady Anne was sitting worriedly in her courtyard, waiting for word from the emperor, hoping that she would be able to leverage on it for Yue Bai's life, when the head eunuch came in accompanied by a few guards, holding a proclamation from the emperor himself. She bowed to receive the message. "By the mandate of heaven, His Majesty extends royal favor to Lady Anne of the Inner Court. For her loyalty and discernment in exposing treachery within our gates, she is hereby elevated to the rank of Mayron. Let her name be recorded in the palace rolls, and her quarters and provisions adjusted to reflect this honor. Let her come forth and speak her wish, for the Son of Heaven shall bestow one favor in accordance with her merit, by the Emperor's own hand, under heaven's mandate." "What do you want His Majesty to do for you, Lady Anne?" the head eunuch asked, after he had placed the scroll in her hands. Lady Anne bowed to the floor. "I ask only for my daughter's life." When the court was summoned the following day, Yue Bai threw herself to the ground in front of her father's throne. "Punish me," she said, "but let him go free. He has only acted in accordance with his own customs and has not deliberately tried to insult you. Oh, my father!" Zuberi turned to her. "No, we stay together." The emperor looked between them. Though his face betrayed no emotion, a long pause fell over the hall. The man who ruled half the world was not easily moved, but he saw something rare in their eyes. Not rebellion, not lust, but loyalty. "I cannot allow this to go unpunished," he said finally. "If order is to stand, boundaries must mean something." His voice rang across the Dragon Hall. For the sake of dignity, and to warn others who would cross the line between guest and crown, you are both exiled. You will leave the palace tonight. You will not return. Yue Bai bowed low. Thank you, Your Majesty. Zuberi did the same. We will remember your mercy. The emperor gave no further word. As they were led out, Lady Anne looked at her daughter for the last time. Their eyes met, mother and daughter. No words were spoken. And then the doors closed behind them. They left before sunrise. The emperor's men gave them plain clothes, a cart with 2 wheels, and silence. A eunuch placed a sealed scroll in Yue Bai's hand, safe passage to the southern provinces. No explanation, no escort, just quiet orders to vanish. The road south was long and uneven. Zuberi pulled the cart when the horses tired, his shoulders firm against the morning mist. Yue Bai clutched a satchel with silver coins, a brush and ink, and a few pages of her writing. They avoided busy towns, stopping only in small villages where the faces were too full of the struggle to survive to care much about the veiled giant and the beauty on the cart. Nights were quiet. Sometimes they slept under trees, sometimes in the homes of kind strangers who asked no questions. Yue Bai once worried that exile would feel like a wound. But walking beside Zuberi, away from whispering halls and narrow glances, she felt a kind of freedom she had never known. It was early summer when they reached the edge of the southern forest, lush, endless, and alive with sound. A river curved through the land like a silk ribbon. Here, Zuberi said, pressing his palm into the warm soil. This is good. They built their home together. Zuberi shaped walls from bamboo and woven mats, strengthened with clay. Yue Bai planted ginger and wild vegetables along the riverbank. When they finished the roof, they stood hand in hand and watched the moon rise through the trees. Zuberi hunted with a spear carved from a fallen branch. He smoked meat, and Yue Bai learned how to recognize safe roots. She boiled herbs and made ink from crushed berries. Each evening they sat by the fire. Yue Bai told stories from ancient poetry. Zuberi replied with tales of the coast. A fisherman who sang to the sea, and a mountain back home where fire lived under the earth. They taught each other slowly. He learned the soft edges of Mandarin. She practiced Swahili in small phrases. Their laughter often said more than language could. In quiet moments, she wrote again. Her brush danced across paper with joy instead of longing. He carved wood into animals, necklaces, and charms, just as he had in his youth. Their love deepened, simple, unguarded, without rule or ceiling. What began as a spark hidden behind palace curtains now glowed like the fireflies that lit their summer nights. Years passed quietly in the forest. The house grew with them. New beams, a second room, small shelves for Yue Bai's writings and Zuberi's tools, and 3 olive-skinned children with wild, curly hair. Locals from nearby settlements came to know them not as exiles, but simply as the dark man and the jade woman who lived by the river. To the villagers, they were unusual but kind. Yue Bai offered herbs for fevers and burns. Zuberi helped repair boats, carved walking sticks for elders, and taught children to tie strong knots. They rarely spoke of who they had been before. Here, they were only themselves. One day, a traveler brought news. Zheng He's ships had returned from yet another voyage, with spices from the far west and rumors of elephants taller than gates. The emperor was old now. Many who had known Zuberi and Yue Bai were gone, their memories swept away by time and new scandals. Will we go back? Yue Bai asked, pouring tea. Zuberi looked at her, then at their children tracing characters in the dirt with a stick. We are already home. They stayed. In a world full of boundaries, dynasties, laws, skin, birth, they had carved a corner where love was enough. Their home stood not in maps or history books, but in the stories their children told when they grew tall and wandered beyond the forest. Some say the river still runs clear there, that if you listen closely, you'll hear poetry and laughter carried on the wind. And on the gate of the old bamboo house, weathered but still standing, you can read, "We chose each other."
Hi, please click on the subscribe button and maybe leave a comment. Thanks.